Evening, friends. Just a quick note that we're going to be pausing the recording for a moment. That way we can go ahead and get some of the in-group business finished so that we can go ahead and get our presenters done or on the call. So thank you very much, and we will pause the recording. So for those of you who are beginning to engage with us now, I want to introduce Reverend Wendy Hudson, who is the pastor of Two Rivers Church. Her church has a specific focus of many different things, but specifically anti-racism work. Reverend Hudson is somebody who was a young adult missionary like myself, but just a few years earlier, she and her family have been living in Charleston for several years now, but she's also had experience doing ministry and working with churches up in the Pennsylvania area. And so Reverend Wendy, go ahead and sort of tell us a little bit more about who you are and sort of what has led you to do this work now.
I'm really honored to be here. So first of all, thank you all, friends. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and also some new folks. I'm going to say around the table. It's better than saying around the computer screen. So it's really good to get to meet you. As Hillary shared, we started Two Rivers Church in Charleston. We celebrated our second birthday at the end of March. And when we first started, we knew that we wanted to be we wanted to be multi-ethnic, multiracial was our first kind of iteration of how we wanted to exist as a congregation. But when we looked around the table at our first 12, individuals and families who were gathered, they were all white except for one Black man. And so we're like, well, we cannot really be multiracial when we are only 1/12 non-white. And so we said, well, we'll make that an aspirational value. That one of our aspirational values is that we will be multiracial, multi-ethnic. But that also it just felt like it didn't have any teeth to it or any meaning or any accountability. Because what does it mean to say that's an aspirational goal? And so then in talking with some other colleagues who are also doing similar new churches, we said, while we can still hold this value that we feel like God is calling us to be multiracial, but we can, while we're waiting for that to be a reality and working for that to be a reality, we can be anti-racist. And so we can commit ourselves as a predominantly white congregation to really living out the values of anti-racism. And so we really believe at Two Rivers that all oppression is intersectional. And so that's why we being inclusive is one of our values. And, when we're going to be inclusive to LGBTQ community and then inclusive to Black community, that also means we have to then be inclusive to the communities of folks who are differently abled. We have to be inclusive to children. So once we started, if we're going to really live into this value of being inclusive, once you start opening that door and walking through it, you have to keep opening the next one and the next one and the next one. But we really have found that because we live in this culture, in a society where white supremacy reigns, we live in a church culture that is created and perpetuated by white supremacy. We live in a government that's perpetuated and created by white supremacy. Really, our anti-racist work in many ways is kind of the bedrock of who we are, and kind of everything that we do springs out of that.
Thank you. I know that is difficult work to translate that to lots of different folks. And I know it's also a difficult thing to talk about with primarily white and Anglo congregations. Yeah. And so what I want to do now is just sort of ask you, how does our present cultural moment, a moment where we have seen a lot of protests against racist killings, but also racist practices, and also, tying in police brutality and lots of different veins of discrimination. What do we risk when we don't talk about these protests or, these instances of police brutality or history of racism in our country, or even the present manifestations of racism of our country, with fellow white Christians and congregation members?
I remember when I had first started, Two Rivers, before we were meeting weekly on Sunday mornings, every Sunday I would go and visit a different congregation. And I was visiting up near Charlotte, and so was recommended particularly at a specific multicultural United Methodist church to go and worship in on a Sunday. And it happened to be the day after the Charlottesville massacre and the Charlottesville effort. And so I really wanted to go and be in a place that was specifically multi-ethnic or multiracial, because I wanted to hear like how they were going to address and talk about that experience in their particular context. And I was shocked that there was no mention of it at all, at all. And so I was so surprised that I emailed, and this is a very large congregation in Charlotte. And so I emailed their pastor and I was like, "Hi, I came to your church." It's probably too forward of me. And I was like, I was really surprised that no, you did not mention Charlottesville at all. And I specifically came because, you're a multiracial congregation. And, and he said, well, we plan we plan our sermon series far out into the future, and we don't want to be reactive, because if we're reactive every time, then we won't ever get to follow through on what we had previously planned. And weren't you there at the beginning when the person who did the welcome said a sentence about it? And I was like, that's not good enough. And kind of what I took away from that experience, that really meant for us as we were starting our own congregation, is that we have to talk regularly, specifically, and scripturally about white supremacy and about anti-racism. It doesn't need to be just a reactive, when there's an incident or a tragedy that occurs, but it needs to be just part of our normal daily conversation in our small groups, in the songs that we sing, in the way that we preach, the topics that we preach on, how we bring in anti-racism work to all of that. Because if not, I think I can think of nothing worse than the gospel of Jesus Christ being irrelevant to the world. And that's how I felt. It felt like when I came in and experienced that Sunday, I was like, is the gospel of Jesus Christ relevant to the great pain that is being experienced right now? And there was no touching on that. So I think one of the reasons why we really, especially as white people, we have to talk about this in our congregations and in our small groups and in our own prayer life and around our families, is because if not, we look irrelevant, out of touch, out of date, to the rest of the world. And we have the greatest news in the world to bring to bear onto the conversations that are taking place. And when we don't do that, we become irrelevant, and that's a fate that equals death. And
Wendy,
respectful to Jesus.
yeah. Wendy, were you always in this place you are now?
No. No.
I think it would be helpful to share a little bit of that with
Sure.
the group. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I grew up in Lancaster. So, when I went to my middle school, when we walked, we came in the morning after we got dropped off, and the gym was, our school was about 50% Black, 50% white, maybe 60-40. And you walked into the gym, and like one half of the gym was all the white kids and one half of the gym was all the Black kids. And there was never a crossing, back and forth. And so that was, my growing up experience. My parents were both educators. So we never talked specifically about race in my household growing up. We never talked about race specifically. I got to see and witness them, but it wasn't language that I had or conversation that I had. When I did my young adult mission program, same as Hillary, my U.S. placement was in Philadelphia. And we lived in like the inner city heart of Philadelphia, in a community that was 30% Black, 30% white, and 30% Latino. It was the first time that I had ever lived in the United States in such a racially diverse neighborhood, you know, where like from house to house to house to house, you know, it was all different. And that really is where I started to have my racial awakening, for lack of a better term, just in getting to hear and experience the stories of my neighbors, how, you know, in that community, if a police car drove up, like we were all afraid of what was going to happen. Like police was never a comforting presence, which when I was growing up, I mean, I was a white person in a middle class white neighborhood. Police were your friends, you know, and that, but like that was like we had a very different experience of what like police in our neighborhood meant. We had a very, you know, a very different experience. It was the first time that I had ever had friends who were Black, had relationships with people, with neighbors who were Black. And so that was really kind of where I started to have my own awareness of what it meant to be a white person in the United States, what it meant to live, what white supremacy was, and how it wasn't just an attitude of my heart, but how it was the structural setting that we find ourselves in that's way bigger than any of us individually. And we can all have loving and changed hearts, but if our structures are the same, white supremacy still reigns. And it was based on those relationships that I started to have that. But I had always served, you know, when I started serving churches, all my churches were, you know, almost all white. Particularly the first church I served in South Carolina, we had a man who came every Sunday with his Confederate flag tie. So some of you may have that same person in your churches. And I will admit that I did not speak plainly and clearly and boldly about the reality of white supremacy, and the evil of racism in my all white congregations until now. I was afraid. I was afraid of the pushback that I would get. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid of hard conversations that I know would take place that I didn't want to have because they were draining. I was fearful, and I, you know, still repent of that. So it's part of why when we, you know, had the opportunity to start a new congregation, why we really wanted to be upfront and clear and unapologetic about what the gospel of Jesus means. Can I actually read a quote from this last chapter that that has knocked my socks off?
Go for it.
It is on page 160 at the very bottom. And it says, the real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, and humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. Faith that emerged out of the scandal of the cross is not a faith of intellectuals or elites of any sort. This is the faith of abused and scandalized people, the losers and the down and out. It was the faith that gave Blacks the strength and courage to hope, to keep on keeping on, struggling against the odds with what Paul Tillich called the courage to be. But I've not been able to get that phrase, you know, that humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. And that's, you know, one thing we've also, you know, committed ourselves to as a congregation is intentionally seeking out opportunities to be in solidarity with people on the margins, whatever that might look like. And it looks different. We have a lot of different solidarity partners, because that's where we find Jesus, is on the margins. And for a lot of our churches, they're filled with comfortable folks. For us white people, a lot of our churches are filled with comfortable white people, sometimes economically comfortable, sometimes comfortable in their position, or you know, with kind of what they believe about God and politics and social issues. And it's really hard, but once we step out into the margins and start really listening to folks whose voices aren't in the center, it radically changes our whole life.
I think those are all really important things that you just said. I also noticing that you were wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. And so like that has been a really touchy phrase for a lot of us, no matter our racial identity. I think it causes a lot of conversation, or maybe blocks a lot of conversation because people sort of shut down. And it's sort of, I know I have the conversation of like, well, all lives matter. Why why do we have only, Black Lives Matter, or, other different movements sort of around different identities that are marginalized? Why do their lives only matter? Lots of people saying that. And then there are some people who, sort of in those same veins, who ask, why can't we all just love each other? Why do we always have to talk about racism? Isn't it just enough to tell people to love one another? Like, why does this specific people group have to matter? And I'm curious, like, what do you say to those people? I'm personally asking for this. But I also know that, like, it is hard to have a conversation when folks are already kind of shut down and they don't understand that certain groups' lives had never mattered. And so it's not saying that, this group is better, but that it is deserving of equal attention. So I may have just gone into perhaps what a little bit you were going to say, but yeah, would you mind sharing with us some thoughts about how you're addressing this in the work that you and your church are doing?
A lot of it goes back to the idea of spending time with folks who are on the margins and deeply listening to folks and their stories. And it also has been always really helpful to me to look at, what did Jesus do? Who did Jesus spend his time with? Where did Jesus spend his energy? Where were Jesus' words of healing and blessing offered the most freely? And it was almost always to folks who were on the margins of acceptable religious society. And so I think for me personally, when I can think of, okay, where was Jesus? And so then if we are followers of Jesus, what does that mean? That where am I called to also go and be? And then that's with folks on the margins. Liberation theology that really started in Latin America in the 60s has this phrase that is called the preferential option for the poor. So God has a preferential option for the poor. And so it doesn't mean that God only loves the poor. In this understanding of theology, it doesn't mean that God only loves the poor, but it means that God has a special place in God's heart and in God's reign and in God's kingdom for the poor, because they are the ones who are the most oppressed, who are the most left out of what the world is able to offer as far as safety and security and having your needs met. And so God is always going to have this special place, this preferential option for those who are the most marginalized. And so I think that for us as people of faith, that can really apply to Black Lives Matter. So in our particular context, there is a preferential option for Black folks in God's reign, in God's kingdom, in the church, for us as white people, because Black folks in our society are the ones who suffer the most chronic oppression. And again, both from people who live out very specifically harmful, that we see all the time, like harmful acts of racism that are very overt. But just because we have this entire system that was built to subjugate a very specific group of people. The very founding of we cannot talk about the history of the United States without talking about slavery, because enslavement was the way that every single system in this country was started. Our government was started because of enslavement. Our financial system was started because of enslavement. Our trade was started because of enslavement. It all is based in that. And for those of us who live in the South, in South Carolina in particular, so many of the places where we do business, and like where my house is and where the school where we worship is built on what is called a plantation. What we like to say at Two Rivers that we like to speak the truth, and so we call things what they are, and it's enslaved labor camp. And so like that's the language that we use. We don't talk about plantations, we talk about enslaved labor camps. And that is really jarring to people when they first hear it, especially white people. White people are like, whoa. But it's the truth. And when we speak things truly and plainly and clearly, then all of a sudden people are like, oh my gosh, like, I don't want to go get married at an enslaved labor camp. I don't want to have my bridal shower at an enslaved labor camp, which is, I live in Charleston. It's a big, what people do around here. But especially when we realize that, we worship on Sunday mornings in a school that is built on the literal blood-soaked land of enslaved Black people. When we're able to talk really plainly and clearly about the reality of race in the United States and how we're able to be, how we participate in that, and how as white people we benefit from that system. I think part of it is like taking the conversation away from personal orientations of our hearts and towards systems that were created and built before any of us ever existed, but we still either are harmed by them or benefit from them. That's one of the ways that I think we can have, as white people, we can have those conversations about, well, all lives matter. But when we can take it away from the personal and put it toward the system, that's something that's been useful for us.
I think one of the best ways to do the system thing you're talking about, I teach political science and government, and early in the year, we're just getting started on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. When we look at all that beautiful John Locke inspired language in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence about all men being created equal and having inalienable rights, okay, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we study that. Then we look at the Constitution. And what I like to point out in the Constitution, because it's really short and really, George Orwell will be proud of how euphemistically it's written, okay, is the Three-Fifths Compromise, okay, where slaves only counted as 3/5 of a person. Of course, the Three-Fifths Compromise does not mention slave or slavery, okay? It says free people and indentured servants are counted as whole people. Indians aren't counted at all because at the time they were considered to be a separate nation, which was pretty much fine with the Native Americans, okay? They wanted to be a separate nation. And 3/5 of all other persons. And I asked my students 2 questions. I said, who does that leave? Okay, who are the all other persons? Okay, well, of course, slaves. And I said, okay, now let me ask you all this question. How did we go from all men are created equal with inalienable rights in 1776 to a chunk of the population being counted as 3/5 of a person in 1787? 11 years, okay? How did we get from that point A to that point B? And I think if you can even begin to answer that question, you may start to understand all of the stuff we're fighting. That's the institutional, that's the root, that's the seed, I think, from all the other institutional racism you're talking about grew, okay? Whether you're talking economic, religious, what have you, it's, at least as far as the US is concerned, that's where it all came from,
Absolutely. Wendy, another question for you. So this is another question, or another point that some people have made to me and perhaps to you. Some folks will say, we'll just put God first and then everything will fall into place. And I was curious what your response is as somebody who does anti-racism work and also does church work.
I would say I would 100% agree with that person. I would say you are exactly right. We are going to put God first. And where do we find God in Scripture? We find God. God is the God of an entire nation of enslaved people in Egypt. God is the God who came and became embodied and took on flesh and blood in an oppressed nation by Rome. God is someone who was crucified and killed as a criminal of the state. So yes, I agree. Let's put God first. And where is God always found first? On the side of those who are suffering. And so I think then that means that if we want to honor God and follow God and pattern our life after God, then that also is where we are to go and to be found and to identify with and to be in relationship with folks on the margin. So I mean, that's a very easy phrase for me to agree with. I think it also can be helpful to ask folks like, well, what do you mean by that? You know, what does that mean to you? What does that phrase mean to you? And so being able to like listen to because I think folks are going to unpack that a little bit differently, probably from person to person. But to me, when we just like keep bringing it back to, like, I mean, like if we keep bringing it back to Jesus, then to me, I feel like we don't have to argue or debate. Because all we do is bring it back to Jesus. Where do we find Jesus? What's Jesus doing? Where can we walk? You know, where can we be with pattern our life after who Jesus was? And I hope that kind of like that's one way that we often kind of like confound people as a congregation, because we have what folks might call progressive values. Yet we love Jesus and we talk about Jesus all the time, and we, as all United Methodists do, preach from the Bible. I mean, it's like we engage in the sacraments. We have communion every Sunday. We baptize people in the ocean. It's our whole life as a community and then as individuals is centered around the person of Jesus. And so to me, if folks are really like pushing back on that, I think, using that phrase, I think we can heartily agree with them that we can go first where God is. And we'll find God in those marginalized places.
I think what you're saying is really important. It's not like, oh, you need to just pursue scripture and then the anti-racism stuff or the justice stuff will just fall into place. Because Cone clearly says, like, not everybody who studies scripture diligently actually does anything with their actions about what they read in scripture. In fact, he says that every time the people who lynched Black people, they were often the good citizens who did not even bother to hide their identities. These were the good Christian folks who enacted these heinous, awful crimes against humanity. And so it's important to remember, like, you can do the two at the same time. You can read scripture and you can also act on that scripture, and you can act on what we read in scripture. And as you said, Jesus is always with the people who are underserved and underprotected in mainstream society, in mainstream religious society. What are the ways that your church people have been showing up for racial justice work? We are going to be designing a sort of call to action kind of at the end of this book study. And we know that there will sort of be individual things that people are probably going to do, but we want to also have some sort of collective call to action as well. So what are some ideas that y'all have, is there a plan that, some things that y'all did immediately, some things y'all are doing now, some things you want to do long term? What does that look like?
We have both, because anti-racist work is always personal and structural. You can't separate those two. It's always about, for us as white people, a personal transformation, a personal reckoning. It's not about guilt. I have a friend who we engage in this conversation all the time. My oldest is 17, and his dad is white also, so he's white. And we're talking about coronavirus, and he said, the most deadly virus in the world are white people. And I was like, you are exactly right on that. He's exactly right. And I was telling this to my friend, and he said, well, isn't that, look what you've done to him. He's like, he's so ashamed of being white. And I was like, he's not ashamed of being white. He's like, well, he feels guilty. I was like, he actually does not feel guilty. But he has this understanding of he has this understanding of what white people have done throughout the course of history. my oldest like loves history, like starting, you know, like from like European history, like all over, and like just the incredible harm that white people have done over time. But I think we can recognize that, and we can admit that, and we can acknowledge that. We don't have to feel guilt about it, because one, guilt is not a helpful emotion in this regard, because it blocks us and also keeps things turned personal and inside, when this is really a much bigger, broader structural issue. So I would say, if you're a white person, don't feel guilty, unless you have like engaged in actions that have harmed other people and your guilt is going to cause you to like make a change, then that's good. But just like a generalized guilt over being white is not useful, and it's not helpful, and it's also not necessary, because we don't have to live in guilt. We can live in hope and possibility that we can be part of making a change in the world. Okay, so sorry, I digressed. I digressed on that, but don't feel guilty, unless you've engaged in actions that harm others, and then use that guilt to make a change, and that's good. But we have both personal and corporate, you know, church-wide responses. So some of our personal stuff, right when the demonstrations started happening, you know, we showed up at demonstrations, as, you know, as individuals, and oftentimes in a support capacity. So we came bringing water and staffing the first aid table and serving as like security. So that was a lot of what we did. We also only attended demonstrations that were led by Black people. Because in Charleston, they had some demonstrations that were led by white people that ended up into the All Lives Matter. And that was not where it was useful for us to be present. And also, we take the lead from Black people. That's also a place where we, as a congregation, individuals have really submitted ourselves to following the lead of Black people, and not doing what we think is best, but following what Black people say that they need us to do. And so we only attended demonstrations that were led by Black people. That was, you know, another important thing. Some of us were willing to like be, use our bodies as human shields. Some people were able to do that. Some people who had health concerns and weren't able to do that. Some people were willing to be arrested and had planned for that if that were necessary in order to protect Black demonstrators. But some people couldn't do that. And so we organized a prayer vigil while demonstrations were happening. And so people were praying in their homes where they, you know, so we really kind of were able to we wanted to make sure to offer something, an individual response that folks could use. You know, congregationally, you know, like this, like my, you know, my shirt is, it's one of our congregations, our shirts that we, made and we sell through our store, our online store. But 100% of the proceeds from this particular shirt goes to one of our solidarity partners called Fresh Future Farm, that is run by, it's founded by a Black woman. All of their employees except for one are Black women, in a predominantly Black low wealth neighborhood in North Charleston. And so, you know, so this was a way for us congregationally to respond to like, we're, somebody says I'm like a walking billboard, you know, for us to be walking billboards, but then also not to profit from that. So that all that profit goes to the farm. And then congregationally, one thing that we do is we do engage with we don't do mission work, because mission work implies that we have something that we need to take and give to somebody else, whether they want it or not. So we engage in solidarity work, which means we only partner with people who've invited us to partner with them. And so, you know, two of our four solidarity partners are Black organizations. One of them is Fresh Future Farm. And so we show up for them the way they need us to. So they needed us to help raise money for hurricane packages in case it's for people to build a shelter in place. And so that's what we did. They were in a dispute with the city of North Charleston, and they needed us to like write letters and show up in a very public way. And so we did that for them. You know, we show up in the ways that they need us to, not the ways that we think are easiest or best. But that's based on relationships, because I've had a relationship for 9 years with the founder of that organization. And so there's a lot of trust there, but it's trust that's built over time and over being willing to submit ourselves to sit at their feet and to show up in the ways that they want us and to follow through with the ways that we commit ourselves to. So those are some of our congregational ways. some like little ways in our also within our day-to-day work. We're looking at transitioning our banking to, there's one Black-owned bank in Charleston. We're looking at transitioning our banking to there and putting our deposit there. We try and only purchase Black-owned businesses as much as possible. It's for our, what we do either individually or congregationally. And we're also really, really careful about the language that we use. So especially in the season of Advent, there's so much around light and dark, where light is good and dark is bad. And so we're really careful to not use that dichotomy. So we're also super careful about the language that we use, not to ever use language that implies that dark, black, night are bad. But instead, to use different types of language and images and metaphors that speak more fully.
Thank you. That's an abundance of.
I'm sorry.
No. That's wonderful. That's great. I mean, I think that that's something that people would have asked for in any case. So I'm glad that you have a plethora of examples. It means that you're being creative and your ministry is really fruitful, and you have a lot of people who are informing, your ministry, and you're able to partner with people. I think that's amazing. A final question for you, and then I'll open it up for other folks. I'm sorry I've sort of taken up a lot of questions, but I know there are a lot of people who talk about how, they're all for peaceful protests against, racism, racist things, but they're not about rioting and looting, etc. And sometimes this is a really hard conversation to have when embarking on work that is trying to come alongside folks who are often economically disadvantaged, and where there are sort of complex instances of protest, but also property is damaged, etc. What do you say to those people who say oh, I'm for this work, but I'm not for this way?
Right. I like to just really highlight the difference between property and people. There is a difference between property and people, but also reminding folks that, because a lot of people then they follow that up with, well, look at Dr. King. Why can't they just be nonviolent like he was? But if you look at any picture or watch any video from that era, those nonviolent protesters received incredible acts of physical violence to their very bodies. There was beatings, there was jailings, there was fire, the fire hose, there were dogs. It was an incredible amount of violence that nonviolent protesters received. And so I think it's really important to make this difference between property and people. And also the idea that, that type of, property damage response is like the cry of the oppressed. And I think it is very helpful to me just to continue to lean into that. But also to say clearly, we as white people cannot tell Black people how to react. That's not our place. That is not our role. That is not where we're supposed to be. And so we can engage in nonviolent acts in our own life. And that's something that we can, support if that's where you're called to, but we cannot tell Black people what to do and how to react when people are being killed and damaged and harmed, which is different than property.
Dawn Stewart, who's a participant whose mic is not working right now, this mentions the Boston Tea Party is an example in our United States history, Anglo United States history in particular, where people destroyed property in the name of freedom, in the name of rights, that were being were desired at the time, right? So This is not out of, this is starting to sound like a phrase to sort of, to say, oh, I don't like this and I do like this. So it's a way of sort of choosing what we will abide by and what we won't abide by. Other questions?
I will say one piece of pushback that we've gotten as a congregation is that, which is why this is so helpful, what you're doing. We often have forgotten how to have like like 101 level conversations to white people around race. Like we can kind of only talk at like a, fourth year graduate level, because it's so much, we didn't start doing this work in May when demonstration started. This has been work that we've been doing for a long time. So I'm really glad to be able to like hear from y'all, because y'all are on the front lines in congregations that are very, very difficult to be in and to have anti-racist conversations.
Are there any other questions for Wendy?
Yeah, Wendy, let me ask you this, and this is a quoting from the book. I'm quoting from 159. And by the way, I mean, in awe of what you're doing. Okay. I mean, I don't see how you can, look so fresh and be so, positive and just, how you're not just dying from fatigue right now from all you have to do and all you have to fight against in the institutionalized racism that is the white church. Okay. Then my hat's off to you. I don't see how you do it on a day-to-day basis.
I'm a white person. It's very easy for me to live in the system. I feel the need to name that as a white person. The system is set up for me. So
but you're fighting against it. There's a book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson that just came out. And one of the things she notes in there is that people who are members of the dominant caste get, basically taken to the woodshed. I mean, they don't get tied to the whipping post literally anymore, but they do figuratively. Okay. If they challenge the caste system, because other members of the dominant caste see them as a threat, maybe even a more potent threat, because they're fighting from the inside. And I'm sure you've gotten pushback. I'm sure you've gotten the nasty the nasty Facebook messages and all that goes with it. But kudos to you for keeping up and fighting the good fight. But my question had to do with a quote from page 159, where Cone says this: one must suppose that in order to feel comfortable in the Christian faith, whites needed theologians to interpret the gospel in a way that would not require them to acknowledge white supremacy as America's great sin. Now, what I'm reading him to be saying there, maybe I'm overinterpreting it, is that theology in the white church is basically an act of accommodation, okay? A way to make people feel good about their bigotry so they don't have to face it. Is that, am I off base on that? Is that?
No, that's exactly how I was going back and reading that along with you. No, that's exactly how, I defer to Dr. Deese here. She's the expert in the room. But yes, and I think because you're talking, you talked about like the dominant caste, the dominant culture, especially in our American context. We need a theology that blesses our system.
Yes.
I mean, we see that. You cannot look at the evangelicals' church support for presidential politics without seeing how, the theological gymnastics that Christian leaders have gone to accommodate and support everything that's antithetical to the gospel is just confounding. But there's no rise up against that because those theological gymnastics, keep the white church in a comfortable place of power and control. And so, yes, that is why like the theologians that our most, and we see this in our seminaries, you know, and our seminaries are training our pastors in a very colonial, Eurocentric model. You know, they might throw in you know, a womanist theologian, a Black woman, or, you know, some like a liberation theologian from Central or South America, but bye, Thomas. But it's really still everything is set up from a white Eurocentric point of view, and it's so damaging because it keeps us comfortable and where we expect to be comfortable.
Yeah, you can't change the polity until you change the theology.
Yes, yes.
Well, you know, you were being diplomatic when you said presidential politics, but I don't have to be diplomatic, so I'll go ahead and say it. I mean, white evangelical Christianity has made a Faustian bargain with Trump. Okay, bottom line. Okay, and it is a classic Faustian bargain. It is a classic sale of the soul to the devil. Okay, basically saying in exchange for a few Supreme Court justices, we'll look the other way. Okay. Unless you're Jerry Falwell Jr., who apparently has his own problems. But that's really what you love. I mean, that's not hard for me. At least for me, it's not hard to figure out. Okay, what's going on there? I mean, that's just a bunch of people deciding they want access to political power, and they'll do what they need to do to get it. You know, I mean, that's, you know.
And just like any major denomination, the young people are leaving in the thousands.
That's the thing that grieves my heart the most. Well, a lot of it, but like the average age of our congregation is 29. You know, I'm almost always one of the 5 or 6 oldest people in the room when we met in a room on a Sunday morning, and so we're all in our 20s and 30s. And that is so many of our folks have stories, you know, where they walked away. They're like, they quit the church and they walked away from the church because they could not stand the overt racism or that marrying of, you know, power to theology or power to their church anymore. Now, God never gave up on them, because we know how that works. And at the end of the day, but you know, because of the pull of grace, like grace kept working. And so they were never fully able to let go of God or really walk away from Jesus. But almost, I mean, 75% of our congregation who had had a previous church experience had quit the church forever.
And Russ, yeah. And those who have made the deal with the devil, they can't even walk away. They can't. They would be afraid to. I mean, because there's no allegiance and there's no loyalty to them, and they will be called out. You know, that call out cancel culture. They would call them out.
Plus, the guy they made the deal with, if we're to believe current news reports, makes, you know, disparaging jokes about them behind their back. You know, what a bunch of suckers, they're following me, look at them, you know. I mean, and so, you know, that's,
again, is that becoming irrelevant is the most disrespectful thing we could do to Jesus. Because Jesus is like Jesus speaks to our current setting every day. Every word out of Jesus' mouth speaks to us today. And it is so harmful and disrespectful to Jesus when we make him irrelevant.
It's worth noting. So I obviously, when we get into this, it's very easy to be political and partisan, but it's also important to say that, you know, while yes, there are some things that are happening in our presidential politics right now that would not have happened under a previous regime, because a previous president, you know, could not have afforded any such way, because they literally would have been ousted in a lot of ways. But it is worth saying that the Bible calls out all injustices with all leaders. And so certainly there are lots of every presidential regime has its own injustice, and we should call it out. We are certainly living in a moment where there are especially a lot of people who are feeling extremely vulnerable, and we should certainly pay attention to that. But I do want to add, at the risk of sounding like I defend certain folks who I don't necessarily defend, I do want to say that, like, the gospel calls everybody out and says we are all vulnerable to idolatry, vulnerable to the sin of idolatry.
Well, I mean, just even look at David, who was, the king after God's own heart, the one, but what was Nathan's role as the court prophet was to always hold David to account, to account to following in the ways of God. And so even the king who had God's heart the most still had an accountable presence there. And so I think, yes, like you're saying, Hillary, I totally agree. It doesn't matter. This isn't a partisan issue for us in the church. It should never be a partisan issue. It should be a prophetic issue of holding our elected leaders to account.
And we've talked a lot about our prison systems, and they're sort of throughout our history, there have been ways in which our prison systems have operated in an extremely racist fashion, both when Republicans and Democrats have been in power. Nobody has helped anybody who's Black or brown in this country, especially when it comes to our criminal justice system. So
all of our systems are still set up to perpetuate white supremacy and to oppress Black people. And we've had, 275 years of leadership from all political parties, and that none of those systems have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? I think we've done a really go on.
It was just I see Wendy in that t-shirt, and if I were to wear a t-shirt like that where I am, Robin would have so many telephone calls complaining about me that, she would just finally take the phone off the hook because I would be gone. And that's the one thing that I'm really struggling with, is, how to walk that line of how to delicately, teach people without them feeling like you're in their face, because everybody right now is in everybody's face. And so it's just, it's really hard. It is really, I find it hard because I have a hard time controlling my mouth and when things are said, and my heart is breaking for the way things are now. And it's just, it's hard to be in ministry at a church when 90 to 95% of them would not handle that at all. They would, I'm working on my sermon today of, I'm doing Exodus where the Israelites are fleeing slavery. And I kept thinking, how can I delicately work, some of this in this wonderful book I've read, and these conversations we've had. How can I, how can I work that in without offending over half of my congregation, And yes, they need offending, but, I would really like to stay another year.
Well, I doubt they'll come to me and say you're talking.
Well, yeah. Or the bishop. Who would they go to, Robin?
I doubt that there is.
Yeah. Not everyone is called to be a walking billboard. That's what I need to say that off the bat. I'm in a very particular cultural context. I'm in a very, in Charleston, I'm in a very particular church context. I'm in a very particular place in my own journey where, and I will say, and I've worn this in like conservative upstate. You know, I wear it around town. I hear all the time. I've never had an overt confrontation wearing it. But also I'm in a place in my journey where like I would be fine if if I had an overt confrontation, that would be fine with me, and I'd be happy to. I mean, not happy, but but I'm also in a place where I can totally engage in that in a way that is safe and maybe not harmful. So not everybody's called to be a walking billboard, but I think we are called as white people to be extra committed to relationships, both relationships with Black folks, because that is how our lives change, and also relationships with the people in our communities, whether it's our churches or our broader community, who are not as far along as we are. Because the deeper we're in relationship with people, the more then we'll be able to have the language, to know the analogies, to be able to use the definitions, to be able to bring up things in ways that will start to move the conversation along. Sunday morning sermons aren't always the time or place for that. I think that's, if you only ever talk about racism in a Sunday, as a Sunday school leader or as a preacher from like your public space, if that's the only time you ever talk about that, that is actually more harmful than I think than never talking about it. Because it's when you can have these one-on-one conversations, when you can share, like, you know, I'm in this group and I had this thing that was really interesting and it made me think about you, or it made me think about this place that we've been to. You know, I think when we can start having those very regular, difficult, vulnerable conversations with people, that's when, in particularly fraught contexts like you're in, Becky, it's slow work. It is slow work. It's work that's built on trust. It's work that's built on relationships. And it's work that's built on honesty and authenticity, which doesn't always mean that it's easy. But it's holy work.
And it's really hard right now because we're not together.
Yes, I agree.
We're not together. You know, I do have a few people, a very few, that I can have those conversations with, but you know, we're in church, but you know, we're scattered and we're out the door.
Right.
And Becky, I will also say that I hear you and I'm with you. And I also want to echo Wendy's words of, Wendy, you said this to me, that relationships move at the speed of trust.
Right.
And the folks that you can have these conversations with, they're your biggest advocates, and they can be your translators in ways that, like, you may not be able to relate to other folks. I do have some folks who are able to translate what I'm saying whenever there's misunderstandings between me and other congregation members, and they've actually been paying attention to this series, and I'm extremely grateful. So thank you, congregation members, for watching this. Even though I may not have folks who officially come week by week, but I do believe that there are folks who are paying attention to this, and you know, these things are available online on YouTube, and so if you feel so led, you can share these public links with some folks and say, like, hey, why don't we have a discussion about this? Or yeah, I mean, you can throw them the cross in the lynching tree, right? You know, that's kind of a like you know, boom. It's a really gutsy move, but I have seen moments where even though things have blown up in my face a little bit, I have been able to work through them and sort of crawl on my hands and knees back to a space where folks are willing to listen to me, even if they never admit that they were wrong.
Right.
Hey, Wendy, I was going to ask if you had any awkward conversations about the shirt that you're wearing. It looks good on you. Have you had any what types of conversations have you engaged with people as far as wearing that shirt?
You know, again, surprise, I just put the link in there. If you would like to buy your own Black Lives Matter shirt, and
Okay, love it.
you would like to support Black women-owned farmers in North Charleston, urban farms in North Charleston, have at it. We also have 19 shirts on there, and tote bags, and cell phone covers. We love our merch at Two Rivers. So, I've not had any direct confrontations about my shirt. Now, I tell you what is interesting, and this, like I said, my kids are 12, 14, and 17, which means like anything that I ever say out loud in public is like horribly like embarrassing and humiliating to them no matter what. So we were at the pool the other morning, my oldest and my youngest, and somehow my oldest brought up, so in Charleston a couple years ago, there was this incident where Academic Magnet High School, which is a predominantly white high school, public high school, but Magnet predominantly white, for all the racial reasons you can understand. At the end of their football game, whenever they would win a football game, they drew essentially like a blackface monkey on the side of a watermelon and would smash the watermelon whenever they won. And so, of course, eventually after this happened, someone called it out publicly for the racist act that it was. And they're like, there's no racism here. We're just drawing a face on a watermelon. I'm like, y'all are at the #1 high school in the state, and really you don't know any history. I mean, come on, give me a break. So anyway, so I don't know why my oldest brought it up, and so we were talking about it, and this guy who was at the pool walked over. He's like older white guy who walked over, and he walked over, like as overhearing our conversation, said, excuse me, it's a mansplaining, that wasn't racism. And I was like, sir, it was definitely racism. No. I know that coach, and that coach would never, ever do anything racist like that. And I said, it was just a watermelon. I said, sir, they knew exactly what they were doing. If you cannot live in the state of South Carolina and not understand the racial history and overtones of exactly what that act was. No, you're wrong on that. You are wrong on that. And of course, like my kids were like sinking down into the water, like trying to hide. And at the end, I was like, well, sir, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And then the awkward thing is, like, so he's at the pool every single time we go back. This man is there. So, part of what we talked, this must have been in my other book club I went to before. I double booked myself with 2 anti-racist book clubs at the same time tonight. We're reading. You can't see it because of my background. So you want to talk about race? Can you see that? We're in my neighborhood on our Facebook page. Somebody put this like really thoughtful, like this is our neighborhood. We're predominantly white. I'd like for us to have a conversation about race in our neighborhood. Which of course they're like brought out every racist in our neighborhood, vocally into that category. So I was like, would anybody like to have a book club? So we're reading this book as a book club in my neighborhood. And one thing we talked about there tonight was there was a list of phrases on Facebook that circulated not too long ago that were very simple one-liners, especially for white people to be able to use when someone says something that is racist to them. And it could be simple as, I don't agree with that. Would you like to explain that again? Tell me exactly what you mean by that. But it's like one-liners that are intended to disrupt and bring attention back to the person and what they just said. So that I was saying, like, this is something we need to like literally print out and carry around in our pockets with us as white people, because these are conversations that we need to be prepared to have. And they're hard and they're awkward and they're embarrassing sometimes. And sometimes they could be fraught with, with the potential for violence. I was in the grocery store and I was wearing this shirt actually. And the man behind me in line had on a Confederate flag mask. And I was like, so I was like, what do I do? I'm in line at the grocery store. I don't know what to do. This man has on a Confederate flag mask. And it was like, it didn't feel like, that felt like a place where making like a public confrontation didn't feel like it would be the most useful. I still don't know what I should have done. I still feel bad that I didn't say it. So instead, I turned around and I'm trying to help get my computer to won't fall. I stood with my arms crossed and I just stared at him the entire time. I stood in line with my back to the cashier so that I could face him walking backwards as my groceries were like going down the car, like walking backwards, like staring at him straight on. And he would never look at me and he would never acknowledge me and he would never like meet my eye. But I was like, I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. And like the person who was like bagging the groceries was this young Black man. And so, you know, I was like, thank you so much for doing. So like, you know, I was like, trying to be like really clear. So I don't know. There are all kinds of things. And sometimes I get it right. Most of the times I feel like I don't. Yeah.
Thank you. Good to see you.
All right, if there are no other questions or comments for Wendy, you were allowed to leave. We will sort of be finishing up and just sort of summarizing the chapter, talking about what we found to be interesting, and then sort of briefly talking about our call to action.
Y'all are amazing. I'm sorry I talk so much. Thank you so much for letting me come. It was great to be with you all.
Thank you for everything,
Thank you,
Wendy.
Wendy.
You were great. Thank you.
Be in touch. Feel free to reach out. Follow us on social media. You can find out ways that we like talk about these things all the time. So thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Don, I appreciate every time we mention the Confederate flag, you counter with the flag of the Army of Tennessee. So briefly, friends, I know we're past our 8:30 mark, but I want to know, and this is a summary chapter, so I wasn't super worried about, you know, giving Wendy the bulk of our time, but what were some of the quotes that just sort of like stuck with you in the same way that the quote stuck with Wendy that she talked about?
Actually, interestingly enough, Mr. Weinberg over here hit on one of the paragraphs that I was stuck in, as far as the theologians and how they reconciled what they were doing. I'm still trying to digest that and put it in, bring it into context, actually.
You know, Sharon, it seems to me, I got stuck in it too, that's why I quoted it. And it seems to me that what he's saying is he put into words something that I've felt for a long time, but didn't really know how to say it. And that is that somewhere along the way, the white church, both evangelical and mainstream Protestants, and I don't know enough about Catholicism to say, okay, but somewhere along the way, the white church turned its back on the tradition that made it. Okay. I mean, you look at Deuteronomy where it says that God loves and you better treat the immigrant right or God ain't gonna treat you right. You know, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but I mean, it says that in Deuteronomy, and Jesus comes along and is the perfect personification and fulfillment of all of those ethical principles that you see in the Deuteronomic law. And it's like the white church hired a bunch of professional theologians, just like you'd hire a lawyer to get you out of a bad contract. Okay. You know, you hire a real smart lawyer, say, look, this is bad for me. This is uncomfortable. Get me out of this. Okay. And it's kind of like the white church hired a bunch of smart theologians to do the same thing for them when it came to that tradition. And we're still to this day reaping the wages of that. Robin, you talked about it. How many people are leaving the church now, you know? And it just seems to me that where we're at right now, you know, we got people leaving the church in droves, and it's like those chickens are finally coming home. Those theological chickens are finally coming home to roost.
Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I have conversations with my two oldest boys. One of them is kind of stuck in the whole why does bad thing happen to good people, and then the other just can't deal with the I'm trying to think of another word other than the one he used. But just basically the craziness that he says goes on in his particular church, and how there's so much. I'm trying to think of a word other. He was going off. Yeah, you say one thing and you do something else, and you don't practice what you preach. So he's one of them is stuck in that whole rut. And especially with what's going on with George Floyd's and all the killings out in the streets and things of that nature, he doesn't see a way that he can tie himself back to the church.
Mm.
I'm stuck sometimes. I don't know what to say to him.
I feel like this book is a good place because I think it affirms a lot of sort of what both of them are actually sort of questioning. I mean, there's a moment where he talks about his fear that God is a white God and God doesn't care for Black people or Black bodies. And in the end, he talks about how the cross needs the lynching tree, which is what Wendy has sort of said throughout this entire conversation. If we are reading scripture and we are not alongside people who are at the edges of mainstream, especially mainstream church society, then we are not effectively living into Jesus' call to make disciples for the transformation of the world. Other thoughts? Or, sorry, Sherm, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. I just said interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that really spoke to me was on the bottom of 165, and it says, whites may be bad brothers and sisters, murderers of their own Black kin, but they are still our brothers and sisters.
Mm.
And, that's what we tend to forget, I remember growing up and as a little girl singing, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. We are all precious in his sight. And yet we weren't taught, we sang that, but we didn't really believe it. Or the church didn't really believe it. And, that's part of one of many hundreds of reasons that I was away for so long. But, we forget sometimes that good or bad, we're all brothers and sisters.
I remember going to a lecture once, and I can't even remember his name. It was a retired United Methodist bishop. And what he said was he was white, and he was talking about the era when the Methodist Church was just beginning to integrate and to come back together. And he said that he kept ministering to the whites that were fighting against that. And the reason was, he said, because somebody had to minister to the Pharisees. And that stuck with me, like, you don't just turn your back on them and say y'all can all go to HE double toothpick, but somebody has to continue to minister to them and hopefully bring them into the fold. And that was many years ago, and it stayed in my heart.
That always makes me think about people that I call it, they think of shallow love. Like they love somebody, whether it's their neighbor, their spouse, their family member, whatever, they love them as long as they're able to keep up with their preferences. So if somebody makes a mistake or somebody has a terrible way of thinking, they abandon them as unlovable. I mean, we do that. I should say we instead of they. Where we base love your neighbor on loving your neighbor that looks like you, loving your neighbor that thinks like you, loving your neighbor that's able to keep all of the law, maybe that you're not even able to keep. And so there's no basis for that love. The gospel teaches us to love our neighbor. And so I'm not just talking about what you were saying, but it is what you're saying. You know, they need us the most. They need the gospel the most.
Mm.
People get so wrapped up in their preferences, in what they think is good or white or light or whatever, that they can't see past it. And so, Becky, when you were saying, you know, people would run me out if I preached that, sometimes I wonder how I can plant seeds, you know, about love and about the sin of not being able to see past our own selves, about inward facing congregation, about, you know, people waste so much time on deciding whether you're wearing the wrong t-shirt or not, or whether what you is love, that we don't even love each other, much less our neighbor on the street. Anyway, sorry, I'm about to preach, but
No, I think those are wonderful, wonderful thoughts. It is a question about like who needs the most conversion, right? There are different ways the gospel can and should be shared. And actually, Sherry, you were in my last book study with me when we talked about, you know, caring for people who are really difficult to take care of is a means of grace. In that context, Bishop Kenneth Carter is writing about taking care of folks who have Alzheimer's and dementia. But there are also folks who remain unconverted to the radicalness of the ways that Jesus is calling us to think and to live.
You know, one of the things that hit me is as somebody who tries to teach and preach and have conversations about how to love, one of the things that he says on page 164, I'll go ahead and say with Russ and Sharon, I was caught in the whole rereading those paragraphs on page 159. But then I was kind of stopped cold at 164 whenever he says, what happened to the hate that created the violence that lynched Black people? What happened to that hate? Where did it go? And then he goes on, did it disappear? What happened to the hate that lynched Henry Smith? And he goes on, did the apology get rid of the hate? And I think that is one of the things for me that I have felt convicted about as far as a call to action is, yes, it's important to teach love, to show love, to inspire love. But it's also important for us in this day and time to identify the hate and to show that it is prevalent in our world in so many ways that is behind a mask of righteousness. Or, you know, we have found ways to decorate, bedazzle it, if you will, so that it doesn't look or sound just like hate when you first receive it. But the longer you sit with it, you realize, wow, that was some deep hate. And so for me, that's one of the things is, no, the apology didn't get rid of the hate because the system still survives. And that's, we've got to identify the hateful language. We've got to identify the hateful actions. We've got to identify the hateful systems and call them out for what they are before people, I think, before we can fully understand that we're in a denial of sorts. Because sometimes this hate doesn't look as bad or isn't as painful as another kind of hate. So I think that was important for me. And at the bottom of 164, he says, unless we confront these questions today, hate and silence will continue to define our way of life in America. And that's kind of scary to me because that's not the gospel. So.
Well, and something that Wendy talked about, and something that I've heard from all sorts of theologians, is that theology is what fuels the justification for a lot of this stuff, right? You know, I'm even more convinced that in our churches we have made way for prejudice to exist and to just be there and even to blossom. And it doesn't necessarily have to be racism. It can be, you know, hatred of people who are poor. It can be hatred of people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. It can be hatred of people who are immigrants. It can be hatred of people who are, you know, not you know,
political parties.
Political parties, absolutely, who don't have the same kind of mind structure or body type. There's all sorts of ways that the church lets prejudice just be fertilized. And where, even though we say we're beloved communities, we don't call it out. In South Africa, the apartheid government structure was birthed out of the Dutch Reformed Church, which has historically been a white supremacist church, and obviously they have done a lot to try and not be that now. But the way that you combat theology of exclusion, the theology that says we are the new Israelites, right? And everybody wants to be the chosen Israelites, right? And or those ancestors of faith who God, you know, picked out and plucked up from, you know, a nothing nation to become a great nation. We have to say it's not the greatness that we worship, it is the fact that God is with us even when we feel like nothing, and even when we are nothing, right? It is not so that we can be more powerful than everybody else and rule them. It is so that we can be among them and we can all coexist and co-labor together alongside God. So you combat bad theology of exclusion with theology of inclusion that makes everybody children of God. So that's a bit of a theological kind of thing that I really love talking about and don't always get to talk about.
Well, it sounds like that seminary education is paying off.
I got really lucky with the people that I got to meet in seminary. That's all I can say. Well, friends, very briefly, just because it is 8:30 now, we will use part of next week to sort of talk a little bit about maybe some of the chapters that we didn't get to spend as much time on, but I also want us to begin thinking about individual calls to action that we want to do, and also a collective call to action. And then finally, I know I sent this out on the MailChimp sort of newsletter, but Angela and I are putting together an article for The Advocate. Sherry, The Advocate is our conference newspaper. It's won all sorts of awards. It's really great. We love it, and like filling it with good material, because there's many times when you know, there's just not a lot to pick from. And so not that it's not great, and Jessica Brody does an amazing job with it, but we want to make sure that this experience here is shared, because it could be a model that other people could have with you know, other people in other places, not necessarily with people in their own charge, because we know that some folks in charges are just not going to want to have these conversations. And so, you know, how we make it available to people and how we share this ministry model is important. We would love some folks to give us their feedback for how this has been for them, for what it has meant for them, even if it's been challenging. So if you would either email Angela or myself about what this has meant for you, how you feel, what it has taught you that is new, and what you feel called to do, sort of as far as thinking differently, speaking differently, acting differently. I think that's it. Angela, do you have any other things to add?
We had the document from the Corinne Shatak the 103 things that white people can do for racial justice that we talked about as far as like the action plan and possibly giving some ideas. And so I guess that's something that we can email out. It's just a Google document just to kind of get your brains kind of geared up in that direction. If you need the jump start, you may already have plenty of ideas that I hope you'll bring to the table, the screen, for personal as well as collective call to action.
And September is sort of a month where the United Methodist Church as a whole is looking at anti-racism work. So if you look at your email that I've sent you through MailChimp, you'll see sort of the anti-racism calendar. You can treat it like an advent calendar, basically, going to the way of making anti-racism work a part of your being, if it's not already part of sort of, or how do I say this? Yeah, if it's something that you've never thought about doing. So, and if you can't find it, go to Google the General Commission on Religion and Race, or is it Race and Religion? Race and Religion.
Religion and race.
Religion and race, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. All right. Those are all the things I have to say. Certainly the internet is full of ideas. We're grateful for your presence and your willingness to stick with us. I know that this has been a growing edge, especially for me and Angela, in terms of like how we host these conversations. I'm sure we have not done everything perfectly. And we look forward to your feedback. So, what now?
I said Hillary's been great though.
Angela has also filled in when I have not had my stuff together. Friends, could I have somebody who will pray us out?
Have I prayed yet? Lisa? I'll pray if you don't want to.
I will.
Unmute
Let's pray.
myself. Okay.
Oh, Heavenly
Great.
Father. Lisa, you doing it or me?
Oh, you can do it.
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay. Gracious God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for this technology that can bring us together even in a pandemic. Lord, we ask now that as we leave each other's presence, we remember that we never leave your presence. Give us all a good night rest and keep us uncomfortable until we are walking and talking the way you want us to. In Jesus' sweet and holy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you,
friends. Have a good
Good
night.
night. Have a great weekend.
Night.
Night.